Roman marriage is usually presented to us as a solemn, orderly institution built on duty, tradition, and social continuity. Yet almost everything we think we know about Roman wedding customs collapses the moment we stop asking what these rituals symbolize socially and start asking what they were actually designed to protect against. From the very first step of an ancient marriage ceremony, Roman wedding traditions were not structured around romance, modesty, or morality, but around fear, vulnerability, and the urgent need for protection against forces the Romans believed were both invisible and actively hostile. The idea that brides wore veils as gentle symbols of purity is one of the most persistent historical wedding myths ever repeated. But when you examine ancient sources closely, the veil emerges not as a moral statement, but as a defensive technology rooted in Roman supernatural beliefs, ancient apotropaic magic, and an obsession with liminal spaces that made weddings one of the most dangerous moments in a woman's life. The flammeum veil, the most iconic object in Roman bride rituals, is usually described in textbooks as a quaint accessory, a bright splash of color meant to mark the bride's special status. Yet this explanation collapses instantly when you confront the ancient bridal veil meaning in its original religious context. Roman brides did not wear white, a color the Romans associated with death, mourning, and ghosts, but instead wrapped themselves in blazing shades of saffron, flame orange, and blood-tinged yellow, colors explicitly tied to fire, sacrifice, and protection. The flammeum veil secrets are not subtle, because fire was believed to repel malevolent entities, confuse wandering spirits, and burn away supernatural attention, making the bride harder to detect during a moment when she was believed to be spiritually exposed. This was not symbolic modesty, because Roman culture had no problem displaying the human body openly in baths, art, and religious festivals, but rather a deliberate attempt to cloak the bride in a barrier of ritual fire as she crossed one of the most dangerous thresholds recognized in Roman religion. This danger stemmed from the Roman belief that transitions themselves were lethal, because whenever a person moved between social categories, physical spaces, or spiritual jurisdictions, they entered what Romans called a liminal state, a concept that sits at the core of liminal spaces ancient Rome feared deeply. A bride leaving her father's household gods but not yet accepted by her husband's Roman household gods existed in a spiritual vacuum, unclaimed, unguarded, and exposed to whatever entities occupied the cracks between worlds. Roman superstitions explained these moments as invitations to hostile forces that fed on instability, uncertainty, and transformation, which is why Roman marriage rituals resemble military countermeasures rather than romantic celebrations. Every movement, color, sound, and gesture was engineered to protect the bride from attack during this fragile interval when her identity itself was believed to be in flux. This belief system becomes impossible to ignore once you examine the physical mechanics of the ceremony, because none of it makes sense unless you assume the presence of an invisible predator. The bride was forbidden from touching the threshold of a new home with her feet, because the doorway was considered a sacred boundary where ancient threshold rituals acknowledged the concentration of supernatural danger, and so she had to be physically lifted and carried across like a contaminated object incapable of safe contact. Roman cultural practices required the doorposts to be smeared with animal fat and wrapped in oil-soaked wool, substances ancient texts explicitly describe as barriers against the evil eye protection known as fascinatio, a force believed to strike through attention, envy, or recognition. This was ancient, protective magic, not symbolism, and it reflects a worldview where spiritual harm traveled through sight, awareness, and identification. The ceremony then escalated into something even stranger, because the groom was required to stage a fake abduction, violently dragging the bride away while she screamed and resisted in a ritual reenactment of the rape of the Sabine women. Modern audiences often misunderstand this as crude theater or patriarchal myth-making, but Roman superstitions explained it very differently because deception itself was believed to be one of the most effective tools against supernatural surveillance. Roman religion secrets reveal that spirits were thought to observe human rituals closely, targeting moments of joy and transformation, and so the wedding was deliberately disguised as chaos and violence to mislead hostile watchers into ignoring it. You do not create elaborate misdirection unless you believe someone or something is watching closely enough to be fooled. This brings us back to the veil itself, because the flammeum did far more than cover the bride's head, as it erased her identity completely. Ancient sources insist the veil remain in place from the moment she left her father's house until the marriage was consummated, warning that removing it early invited catastrophe not in social terms but in supernatural consequences. Pliny the Elder described the veil as forming a wall of fire around the bride, language that aligns perfectly with ancient wedding magic designed to disrupt recognition, because Romans believed that spirits hunted by locking onto faces, hair, and personal essence. Hair in particular was considered a powerful spiritual transmitter, which explains why Roman bride rituals required it to be divided into 6 braids using the tip of a spear that had drawn blood in battle. This act, horrifying by modern standards, makes perfect sense in a system of ancient apotropaic magic where iron that had killed was believed to sever spiritual attachments and cut through malevolent influence. The idea that this was about beauty or decoration dissolves entirely once you realize the spear had to be a real weapon, preferably one used in combat, because death-infused iron was thought to terrify hostile forces. Roman marriage rituals thus turned the bride's own body into a defensive fortress, layering fire, blood, iron, noise, and deception into a coordinated system of protection. Roman marriage, in this light, was not merely a social contract, but a ritualized survival event structured to escort a vulnerable individual safely across metaphysical territory believed to be infested with danger. What makes this even more unsettling is that Rome was not unique in this belief system, because when scholars began comparing wedding veil history across ancient Mediterranean traditions, the same logic appeared again and again in cultures that had limited contact with one another. Greek brides wore the credemnon veil, which texts describe as rendering them unseen to gods and men, while Jewish traditions used the hinuma veil specifically to obscure the bride from demonic recognition. Persian ceremonies involved face coverings, meant to shield women from Ahriman, the destructive spirit who targeted moments of joy, and these cross-cultural veiling practices consistently framed concealment as survival rather than modesty. Anthropologists studying ancient wedding customs have noted that veiling traditions are strongest in societies that also practiced elaborate ancient wedding magic, protective rituals explained in manuals, prayers, and sacrificial rites designed to avert evil through distraction and concealment. This pattern destroys the Victorian-era myth that veils symbolized chastity, a projection imposed by later cultures uncomfortable with the raw supernatural worldview of antiquity. Roman religion secrets showed that sexuality itself was not considered shameful because Roman households displayed erotic art openly and worshipped fertility gods without embarrassment. What terrified them was not desire but disruption, because the transition from maiden to wife represented a rupture in cosmic order that required intense stabilization. Roman bride rituals even included touching the warm entrails of sacrificed animals, a blood-based protective measure believed to anchor the bride to the living world, while guests hurled nuts and dried fruits in a ritual known as spatio to confuse hostile forces with multiple moving targets. These were battlefield tactics translated into domestic space, reinforcing the idea that ancient marriage ceremonies were defensive operations rather than celebrations. The final moment of the ritual, the unveiling, confirms this interpretation completely, because it was treated not as a romantic reveal but as a sacred exposure called the anacalypteria, a term normally reserved for religious revelations. The veil could only be removed by the husband, and only after the bride entered the protective jurisdiction of his household gods, at which point her vulnerability was believed to transfer to him. If consummation did not occur, the veil had to be worn again, because until the physical union anchored her identity fully, she remained at risk. Ancient medical texts even warned that brides left unveiled too long before consummation could attract incubi, reinforcing the belief that unseen entities specifically targeted women in transitional states. The veil was never about hiding from the groom because it existed to hide from everything else. When modern historians dismiss these ideas as primitive superstition, they miss the deeper truth that these rituals were systematic, consistent, and deeply embedded across centuries of Roman cultural practices. Societies do not maintain complex protective systems unless they believe the threat is real, and whether that threat was supernatural or psychological does not change the function these rituals served. The flammeum veil was concealment, camouflage, and protection, an ancient technology for surviving the most dangerous passage a Roman woman would ever face. Wedding ritual origins were not romantic because they were born from fear, uncertainty, and the desperate need to preserve lineage in a universe believed to be actively hostile during moments of change. The unsettling conclusion is that ancient Mediterranean traditions did not veil brides to control them, shame them, or hide them from human eyes, but to keep them alive long enough to complete the transition into protected social existence. Roman marriage was a negotiated truce between human order and a supernatural landscape believed to be filled with predators waiting for the smallest lapse in ritual defense. The flame-colored veil was not fashion, virtue, or modesty, but a shield, a mask, and a last line of defense against forces Romans believed were watching closely and waiting for the moment a woman stood unguarded between worlds. Once you understand that, the modern wedding veil becomes not a symbol of innocence, but the fossilized remnant of ancient fear, preserved across centuries as its original purpose faded from memory, leaving behind a tradition stripped of the terror that created it. And if this single ritual hides so much forgotten danger, the real question becomes how many other wedding customs we still practice today were originally designed to protect us from threats we no longer remember believing in.